The future of America is being built right now, and most people have no idea what it will cost. At 5:17 in the morning, Thomas Bennett heard the factory whistle before he saw the smoke. He stood outside a Pittsburgh steel mill, his hands buried in the pockets of a worn wool coat. Above the rooftops, a gray cloud of coal smoke disappeared into the cold November sky. Around him, hundreds of workers hurried through the gates. Some had come from nearby farms. Others had traveled from towns Thomas had never heard of. They were all heading toward the same enormous building, where furnaces glowed behind thick brick walls and machines shook the ground beneath their feet. Thomas was 28 years old. His father had been a farmer in Pennsylvania, where life followed the rhythm of sunrise, planting, and harvest. But America was changing. Railroads were stretching across the country. Coal mines were expanding. Steel mills were rising beside rivers. Factories were producing goods faster than ever before. And every new machine created a new question: who would operate it? Thomas had come to Pittsburgh looking for an answer. The steel mill promised something farming could not guarantee: a regular paycheck. $12 a week could mean food on the table, rent paid on time, and perhaps enough money to send home to his mother. To Thomas, the factory looked like opportunity, but he could not yet understand the larger transformation taking place around him. The factory was becoming part of a new American system, one built on machinery, transportation, capital, speed, and an enormous demand for workers. Between 1877 and 1914, American cities would grow rapidly. Factories would multiply. Millions of people would move toward places where they believed work was waiting. And many of those people would come from across the ocean. By the time Thomas reached the mill floor, the morning light had disappeared behind smoke. Steam hissed through pipes. Belts turned overhead. Carts carried raw materials toward enormous machines. Thomas quickly learned that the factory did more than produce steel. It created a new way of life. Before industrialization, much of American work followed the rhythms of farms, small shops, and local businesses. Now the clock mattered more than the sunrise. A whistle announced the beginning of a shift. Another marked its end. Thomas could count his earnings each week, but the work demanded long hours and constant attention. Outside the mill, Pittsburgh was changing just as quickly. Railroads carried coal toward the factories and steel away from them. New neighborhoods appeared around industrial districts. Stores, boarding houses, churches, and markets followed the growing population. Thomas often walked along the river after work and watched trains pass through the city. He began to understand something important. The railroad and the factory depended on each other. Steel made more railroads possible. Railroads made it easier to move coal, machinery, food, and people across enormous distances. America was becoming connected in ways earlier generations could hardly imagine. But there was one problem machines could not solve. Factories needed workers, and America was beginning to look beyond its traditional labor force. Across the Atlantic, thousands of people were already on their way. In the spring of 1892, 19-year-old Elena Rossi stood on the deck of a steamship and watched the American coastline appear through the morning mist. She had spent days crossing the Atlantic. Beside her were families speaking Italian, Polish, German, Yiddish, and other languages. Elena held tightly to a small suitcase. Inside were a few dresses, family photographs, a wool scarf, and a letter with an address written carefully in dark ink. She had left Italy because her family needed a better future. America was not a guarantee. It was a possibility. When Elena finally reached New York, the city overwhelmed her. Buildings rose above crowded streets. Horse-drawn wagons moved through busy intersections. Vendors shouted from sidewalks. People hurried in every direction. New York was becoming a meeting place for people from across the world. Elena followed the address in her hand to a neighborhood where Italian families had established homes, shops, churches, and small businesses. Her relatives welcomed her into a crowded apartment. The space was small, but to Elena it represented a beginning. The next morning, she began looking for work. She quickly discovered what Thomas had already learned in Pittsburgh. American industry needed people. Factories needed workers. Workshops needed hands. Restaurants, laundries, clothing manufacturers, and stores all needed employees. Elena found work in a garment workshop. She spent long hours surrounded by fabric, sewing machines, and other immigrant women. The work was repetitive, but she was grateful for the wages. Each week, She sent part of her earnings back to her family. She was no longer simply a daughter living in a small Italian village. She was becoming part of a rapidly changing American city. But arriving in America did not mean leaving the old world behind. Immigrants brought their languages, foods, customs, faiths, and traditions with them. Neighborhoods became communities where newcomers could find familiar faces while learning how to navigate a new country. Yet one question remained. Could they truly belong? By the middle of the 1890s, Elena had begun to understand the strange rhythm of New York. The streets seemed never to sleep. Workers filled the sidewalks before sunrise. Delivery wagons moved between stores. At night, electric lights pushed back the darkness. The city was exciting, but it was also crowded and expensive. Families lived together in densely packed tenement buildings. Several people might share a single apartment. In Pittsburgh, workers lived close to the steel mills because transportation was limited. The closer the factories grew, the more crowded the neighborhoods became. This was the paradox of industrial America. Industrialization created jobs that attracted people to cities. But more people created housing problems, sanitation concerns, crowded streets, and new pressure on city governments. The same growth that promised opportunity also created problems that individual families could not solve alone. Elena felt this tension every evening when she returned from the garment workshop. Her paycheck gave her independence, but her living conditions reminded her how little control she had over the forces shaping the city. Thomas felt something similar beside the Monongahela River. His job provided a steady income, but the factory determined the hours of his day, the rhythm of his week, and much of his future. Two people, separated by hundreds of miles, were experiencing the same transformation. One had arrived from across the ocean. The other had grown up in America. Both had been drawn towards cities because industrial America promised opportunity. But another question was becoming impossible to ignore. If the cities were growing richer, who would protect the people doing the work? By the first years of the 20th century, the question of work had changed. It was no longer simply about finding a job. It was about what workers could expect from those jobs. Thomas had spent more than a decade learning the rhythm of the steel mill. He knew when to arrive, when to rest, and how carefully every dollar had to be managed. But he also saw the same concerns among the workers around him. Long hours, low wages, dangerous conditions. One person could complain, but a group of workers could make their concerns impossible to ignore. Across America, labor unions were becoming an increasingly important part of industrial life. Workers organized for higher wages, shorter hours, safer workplaces, and greater security for their families. Thomas did not become an organizer overnight. At first, he listened. Workers compared wages. They discussed schedules. They talked about what happened when a person could no longer keep up with the demands of the job. Slowly, Thomas began to understand that the factory was changing more than the way people worked. It was changing how they thought about their own power. In New York, Elena saw a similar transformation. The women in her garment workshop came from different countries. They spoke different languages. They followed different traditions. But inside the workshop, they shared many of the same concerns. Long hours affected everyone. Low wages affected everyone. The desire for a secure future crossed national boundaries. Elena had once believed that success in America simply meant working hard and saving money. Now she was beginning to understand another part of the American experience. Sometimes progress required people to stand together. As the 20th century began, America was becoming more diverse. Elena had now spent nearly a decade in New York. She could speak English well enough to manage at work. She knew the streets. She had built friendships with women whose families came from places she had once known only from maps. But becoming American was not always simple. Italian bakeries stood near Jewish shops. German families lived alongside Irish families. Children often spoke one language at home and another at school. The city was becoming a remarkable mixture of cultures. But that mixture also created tension. Some Americans welcomed immigrants because industries needed workers. Others worried that immigration was changing the country's language, customs, and character too quickly. Elena could feel that tension. She had come to America because she wanted to belong, but she wondered whether belonging meant giving up part of the world she had carried across the Atlantic. Thomas encountered a different version of the same question. At the mill, workers from many countries depended on one another. Their backgrounds mattered less than whether they could perform the job. Outside the factory gates, however, cultural differences became more visible. America needed workers. Immigrants needed jobs. The relationship helped power industrial growth, but it also created social tensions. The country was being forced to ask a difficult question. Could America create a common identity without erasing the differences that were becoming part of its character? By the first decade of the 20th century, the promise of industrial America could no longer be separated from its cost. Workers were asking, how many hours should a person work? How much should a family need to live with dignity? What responsibility did a growing company have toward the people whose labor kept it running? These questions were becoming part of a national conversation. Workers organized meetings. Unions grew. Reformers entered crowded neighborhoods. Journalists reported on difficult living conditions. Social workers documented the problems faced by poor families. Community leaders pushed for better sanitation, education, housing, and public services. The country was beginning to recognize something important. Economic growth could not be measured only by the number of factories or the amount of steel produced. Progress also had to be measured by what ordinary people experienced every day. Thomas decided to attend a labor meeting. Elena also listened closely when workers began organizing in New York. People from different countries discovered that they could cooperate when they shared the same economic pressures. Industrialization had brought workers together physically. Now their shared experiences were bringing them together socially. By the years leading toward 1914, these changes could no longer be treated as temporary problems. Reformers were asking, if factories, railroads, and businesses could become modern, why should the lives of ordinary workers remain unchanged? In Pittsburgh, Thomas saw evidence of a new way of thinking. Newspapers reported on working conditions. Community leaders discussed public health. Workers talked about wages and hours with a confidence that would have seemed impossible when Thomas first entered the steel mill. In New York, Elena watched immigrant neighborhoods become permanent communities. Families opened businesses. Children attended American schools. Newcomers learned English while continuing to speak their native languages at home. The progressive era brought these questions into a broader national conversation. Reformers pushed for better housing, improved sanitation, public education, workplace protections, and changes in city government. Their efforts did not solve every problem, but the direction of the country was changing. People were beginning to believe that government and communities had a responsibility to address the social consequences of rapid economic growth. By 1914, Thomas Bennett barely recognized the America he had entered as a young man. The steel mill still filled Pittsburgh's morning air with smoke. The factory whistle still divided the day into measured hours. But everything around it had changed. Cities were larger. Streets were busier. Railroads connected distant regions. People from many countries had become part of everyday American life. Thomas had spent decades watching that transformation from the factory floor. He had seen workers arrive looking for opportunity. He had seen families settle near industrial districts. He had seen communities grow around the jobs created by America's expanding economy. And he had seen workers discover that their voices mattered when they stood together. In New York, Elena had reached a similar moment. She was no longer the 19-year-old immigrant who had stepped onto American soil with a small suitcase and an address written on a piece of paper. She had built a life. She had watched immigrant children grow up speaking English at school while maintaining another language at home. She had learned that becoming American did not necessarily mean forgetting where you came from. For Elena, America had become a place where different histories could exist beside one another. The country had gained enormous economic strength through steel, railroads, factories, finance, and cities. Immigration had supplied many of the workers who powered this growth. Immigrant communities, in return, reshaped American cities and culture. But the transformation had also revealed problems prosperity alone could not solve. Workers wanted security. Reformers wanted healthier cities. Families wanted education and opportunity. Immigrants wanted the chance to belong without erasing their past. Thomas and Elena had followed different paths. One had entered a factory searching for steady work. The other had crossed an ocean searching for a future. Together, their stories represented millions of people who helped transform America. Between 1877 and 1914, America did more than produce more steel, build more railroads, and fill more factories. It changed the meaning of work. It reshaped its cities. It transformed its population, and it forced a growing nation to reconsider who belonged within its promise. The America that emerged in 1914 was more powerful, more urban, more diverse, and more conscious of the challenges created by its own success. And perhaps that was the greatest transformation of all. The people who built the new America had also begun demanding a voice in deciding what America would become.